What if the most powerful weapon in an interstellar war wasn't a dreadnought or a planet killer, but a lullaby? What if the key to breaking a cycle of annihilation that had spanned generations wasn't found in a war room, but in a nursery? You've probably felt it in your own life, that gnawing frustration. The feeling that your best efforts are just waves crashing against a cliff. You pour everything you have into a project, a relationship, a goal, and the results just don't match the sacrifice. Ever wondered why your effort doesn't equal your results? It's a deeply human feeling, a sense of being fundamentally underestimated, of screaming into a void that refuses to listen. We, as a species, have carried that feeling with us to the stars. We found ourselves in a galaxy that was ancient, powerful, and utterly indifferent to our existence. And in that vast, cold darkness, we met the Cathar. In this story, you are going to discover a truth that defies every law of strategy and every instinct for survival. You will learn how the perceived weaknesses of humanity, our empathy, our vulnerability, our strange sentimentality, can become our greatest, most unpredictable strength. This isn't just a tale of aliens and spaceships. It's a blueprint for understanding how to redefine power, how to find victory not in overwhelming force, but in a courage so profound it can disarm the most terrifying predator in the universe. It's a story that will challenge everything you think you know about strength and survival. The first truth you must understand is this. The Galactic Federation's war against the Cathar Empire was a catastrophic failure from its very first shot. For over a century, humanity and its allies in the Galactic Consortium had been locked in a conflict of total extermination. The Cathar were, by every metric, superior. Their bodies were masterpieces of genetic engineering, apex predators evolved and then perfected for combat. They were taller, faster, stronger, and possessed a chitinous armor that could deflect standard plasma rifle fire. Their ships were not machines of metal and wire. They were living things, bioorganic leviathans that healed themselves and communicated with their pilots on a telepathic level. They were the galaxy's ultimate boogeyman, a force of nature that swept through systems with the finality of a supernova. The Federation's official position, repeated in every broadcast and taught in every school, was that the Cathar were unthinking beasts. They called them the Scourge, the Horde. They were described as having no culture, no art, no emotion beyond a predatory hunger for conquest. This was the Federation's biggest mistake, the fatal assumption upon which trillions of lives would be lost. They believed they were fighting monsters. They were wrong. They were fighting parents. On the fringe of the contested Veil Nebula, the research vessel Stargazer was not looking for a fight. It was a ship of science, crewed by xenobotanists, geologists, and one particularly stubborn xenolinguist named Dr. Ilara Vance. Ilara wasn't a soldier. She was a scholar, a woman whose entire life was dedicated to the radical idea that communication was always possible. She believed the Cathar language wasn't just the guttural roars the Federation's war drones recorded. She believed there was a syntax, a logic, a soul hidden within the noise. Her superiors called her naive. Her colleagues called her obsessed. She just called it her job. When the Cathar battle cruiser, a monstrous obsidian-black creature that blotted out the stars, tore through the nebula, the Stargazer didn't stand a chance. The attack was swift, brutal, and impersonal. Alarms blared, the ship screamed as it was torn apart, and Ilara found herself strapped into an escape pod, jettisoned into the swirling chaos of the nebula just moments before the Stargazer's core went critical. Her pod crash-landed on a moon the Federation charts had marked as XK 1138, a barren rock of no strategic value. The air was thin but breathable, a mix of nitrogen and argon that scraped the lungs. The landscape was a desolate vista of jagged, purple rock under a sky choked with violet and crimson gas clouds. For 3 days, Ilara survived on emergency rations, her only company the crackle of her suit's radio, broadcasting a distress signal she knew would never be answered. The Federation wrote off ships in the Veil. It was a graveyard, a line item in a budget of loss. On the 4th day, her search for water led her to a shallow canyon carved by ancient, long-vanished rivers, and it was there, huddled in the shadow of an overhang, that she found it. It was a young Cathar. It was no larger than a Terran wolf, but it was unmistakably one of them. The same chitinous plating, the same quad-jointed limbs, the same terrifying mandibles flanking its mouth. But it was small. Its armor was not the gleaming, hardened obsidian of the adults. It was softer, a dull, bruised gray and cracked in several places. One of its forelimbs was twisted at an unnatural angle, and a dark, viscous fluid, the Cathar equivalent of blood, seeped from a wound in its side. It let out a low, pained, clicking sound, a sound that wasn't a roar of aggression, but a whimper of fear. The training kicked in instantly. 1,000 simulations, 100 manuals, the voices of a dozen grim-faced instructors screamed in her head. A Cathar, no matter the size, is a threat. Neutralize on sight, no hesitation, no mercy. Her sidearm was in its holster, a compact plasma pistol capable of punching a hole through solid steel. One shot, that's all it would take. It was a threat, an enemy, the offspring of the monsters who had just murdered her entire crew. Her hand went to the weapon, her fingers wrapped around the grip. The small creature flinched, its large, black, multifaceted eyes fixing on her. It didn't hiss, it didn't snarl, it made that tiny, broken sound again. And in that moment, Elara Vance made a choice that would alter the course of galactic history. She saw not the monster from the propaganda posters. She saw a child, alone, hurt, and afraid. She saw herself stranded and abandoned in a hostile universe. She let go of the pistol. Slowly, deliberately, she unsealed her helmet, letting the thin, cold air wash over her face, an act of profound vulnerability. She took a step closer, her hands raised, palms open. The universal gesture of peace, a gesture the Federation had long since forgotten. The young Cathar watched her, its head cocked, a flicker of something unreadable in its dark eyes. It was a moment that defied a century of hatred. It was the first win, a small, silent victory of compassion over programming. The spark within, the strange, illogical, and utterly human spark of empathy, had just been struck in the heart of enemy territory. She was no longer a Federation scientist. She was just a person, and before her was not just an enemy, but a life. And she was going to save it. Elara spent the next hour earning the trust of the creature she decided to call Spike, for the small, undeveloped horns on its head. It was a slow, terrifying process. Every instinct the young Cathar possessed screamed that she was a threat. Every instinct Elara possessed screamed that it was a killer, but her training in xenobiology gave her an edge. She recognized the low-frequency vibrations emanating from its chest not as a precursor to attack, but as a sign of distress, similar to a purr in a Terran feline, but resonating with pain. She didn't approach it directly. Instead, she sat 20 feet away and began to work on her own supplies. She laid out a medkit carefully, methodically. She synthesized a nutrient paste from her rations. She didn't look at Spike, but she was aware of its every subtle movement, the twitch of its mandibles, the shifting of its multifaceted eyes. She was making herself predictable, non-threatening. Finally, she took a small portion of the nutrient paste and slid it across the rocky ground. It stopped halfway between them. Spike watched it, then looked back at her. The gesture was meaningless in its culture, which was based on the hunt, the kill, the taking of what was needed. The concept of a gift, freely given from a potential rival, was utterly alien. For a long time, nothing happened. The violet sky swirled above them. Then, with painstaking slowness, the injured creature dragged itself forward. It sniffed the paste, its delicate olfactory sensors twitching. Then it lapped it up. It was a breakthrough, it was acceptance. With that small bridge of trust established, she was able to get closer. She spoke to it, not in words it would understand, but in a soft, soothing tone, the universal language of calm. She showed it the medical scanner, running it over her own arm first to demonstrate it was harmless. Then she scanned its broken limb. The bone was fractured but not shattered. The wound in its side was deep, a puncture likely from the crash that had orphaned it. With movements that were deliberate and serene, she cleaned the wound with an antiseptic spray. The creature flinched at the cold sensation but did not attack. It watched her with an unnerving intelligence. She applied a biofoam sealant that would harden and act as a temporary cast and bandage. As she worked, she hummed. An old tune her grandmother used to sing to her when she was a child, a simple, looping melody from a forgotten earth. A lullaby. The effect was astonishing. The vibrations in the young Cathar's chest softened. The tension in its small, powerful muscles eased. It leaned into her touch just slightly, a millimeter of movement that was as profound as a continental shift. She was dismantling its predatory instincts with kindness. She was overwriting 1,000,000 years of evolution with a simple melody. This was the deeper value, the core of the revelation. The Cathar were not immune to comfort. They were not immune to care. Their aggression, their ferocity, was a shell built around a core that was just as vulnerable as any other living things. And no one in the Federation had ever thought to try and get past the shell. They had only ever brought bigger hammers to try and break it. For the next 10 days, they became a unit, a bizarre, impossible family. Alara learned its rhythms. Spike, as she now called him, was nocturnal. During the harsh light of the gas giant that served as this moon's sun, they would shelter in the canyon. Spike would sleep, a deep, restorative hibernation, while Alara planned their next move, rationed their supplies, and worked on modifying her distress beacon. She couldn't risk a broad Federation signal. If they were rescued, Spike would be killed instantly. She was trying to isolate a specific frequency, a deep-range scientific channel, hoping a research vessel, not a warship, might hear her. During the long, violet twilight and the deep, stardusted night, they would travel. Spike, despite his injuries, was the superior navigator. His senses were attuned to this world. He found shallow pools of water, rich with minerals, and dug for edible roots with his uninjured claws. He was teaching her how to survive in his world. She, in turn, was teaching him something else entirely. One night, as a meteor shower painted fiery streaks across the sky, Spike let out a series of sharp, clicking barks. Alara had started to catalog his vocalizations. This one was new. It was agitated, but not aggressive. He was looking up at the sky at a specific point in the churning nebula. He was afraid. Alara looked through her macrobinoculars and saw it, a glint of light, a ship, and it wasn't a sleek Federation vessel. It was organic, jagged, and dark. A Cathar scout ship was descending through the atmosphere. They had been found. This was the moment she had been dreading. Her protection of Spike was one thing when they were alone. But now the adults were coming, the true predators, the killers of her friends. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to hide. But she looked at Spike, who had limped closer to her, pressing against her leg. The creature she had saved was now trying to shelter her, a tiny, broken shield against his own kind. And she knew she couldn't abandon him. This was the ultimate test of her courage. Not the courage to fight, but the courage to stand still. The Cathar scout ship landed 100 yards away, its landing legs, like the talons of a great bird, digging into the rock. It was silent for a long moment, scanning, assessing. Then a ramp lowered and two figures emerged. They were immense. At least 9 feet tall, their obsidian armor gleaming in the eerie light of the nebula. They carried weapons that looked like extensions of their own bodies, biomechanical rifles that pulsed with a faint internal light. They moved with a liquid grace that was terrifyingly predatory. They were the apex, the ultimate expression of Cathar genetic superiority. They saw her immediately. They froze. Their posture shifted, a subtle but unmistakable transition into combat readiness. Alara felt the air grow cold, the pressure of their attention like a physical weight. Her hand instinctively hovered over her pistol, a useless gesture against such power. But before she could move, before they could fire, Spike did something that had never happened before in the recorded history of the Cathar Empire. He moved in front of her. He spread his small, injured body as wide as he could, shielding her from their view, and he let out a sound she had never heard before. It wasn't a whimper of pain or a click of distress. It was a defiant chirp, a possessive, protective call, a declaration, "Mine, do not touch." The two adult Cathar stopped dead. Alara could almost feel their confusion, a wave of disbelief that was palpable even from this distance. They lowered their weapons just slightly. Their heads tilted in unison, a gesture of profound curiosity that mirrored what Spike had done when he first saw her. One of them let out a low rumble, a question directed at the small creature at her feet. Spike responded with another series of chirps, gesturing with his head from the adults to Alara and then to his own bandaged leg. He was communicating. He was telling them the story. He was vouching for her. One of the adults, the larger of the two, took a slow step forward. It was the warlord, the leader. Alara could tell by the more ornate, scarred plating of its armor. It stopped 10 feet away, its multifaceted eyes scanning her from head to toe. It saw her unsealed helmet, her empty hands, her lack of armor. It saw the medkit at her feet. It saw a creature that was soft, fragile, and inexplicably alive in the presence of its young. The Cathar warlord was a veteran of 1,000 battles. It had slaughtered entire battalions of humanity's best soldiers. It had looked into the faces of fear, hatred, and defiance. But it had never seen this. It had never seen a lesser creature armed with nothing but compassion. Alara knew this was the pivotal moment. She had to build on the foundation Spike had created. She activated her universal translator, a small device on her wrist. It was experimental, designed for her theories about Cathar language, and had never been tested. She prayed it would work. "I mean you no harm," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. The translator converted her words into a series of low-frequency clicks and rumbles. The warlord's head snapped towards her, a clear sign of surprise. It understood. It replied, its voice a deep, resonant vibration that the translator rendered into flat, robotic English. "You are human, the destroyers, the plague." The words were filled with a cold, ancient hatred. "I am a scientist," Alara countered, keeping her tone even. "My ship was destroyed. I found your young. It was injured. I helped it." "Why?" the warlord rumbled. The single word was not just a question. It was a challenge to her entire existence. Why would a member of a species they were at war with show mercy? Why would prey attempt to help a predator? It was a violation of the natural order as the Cathar understood it. "Because it was alone," Alara said simply, "and it was in pain. My plague, as you call it, believes that no one should have to suffer alone." The warlord was silent for a long time. It looked from Alara to the small, defiant youngling at her feet and back again. It was processing an impossible amount of new data. A century of Cathar doctrine, of military strategy, of cultural identity was being challenged by one small, soft-skinned creature and a simple act of kindness. The fatal assumption that humanity was nothing more than a mindless, destructive force was beginning to crack. And in that silence, Alara Vance sealed her credibility. She didn't plead for her life. She didn't offer secrets or bargains. She just stood her ground, a testament to a different kind of strength. The warlord couldn't see it as strength, not yet, but it saw something that was undeniably powerful, powerful enough to tame one of its own. So let's take a breath and see where we are. A single human scientist, armed with nothing more than a medkit and a song from her childhood, has just done the impossible. She has stood down two of the most feared warriors in the galaxy, not by fighting, but by healing. She has proven that the impenetrable wall of Cathar aggression has a door, and the key is empathy. This is a monumental shift, a crack in the foundation of a century-long war. But this is just one warlord and one scout ship on a forgotten moon. The Cathar Empire is vast, a sprawling civilization of trillions, and the Galactic Federation's war machine is already gearing up for its next major offensive. What happens when this impossible truth, this story of a human and a predator's child, escapes this small canyon and ripples out into the galaxy? The consequences will be more explosive than any superweapon. Have you ever had a moment like that? A moment where you had to stand your ground, not with anger or force, but with a quiet, unshakable conviction in what you knew was right, even when the entire world told you that you were wrong, that you were naive. The Cathar warlord, whose name translated roughly as Kalen, made a decision that would send shockwaves through his own rigid, honor-bound society. He did not kill Alara. He did not take Spike and leave her to die. Instead, he made a gesture that was, in Cathar culture, a sign of temporary, cautious alliance. He retracted the menacing claws on his right hand, leaving a vulnerable, three-fingered palm exposed. He was mirroring her own gesture of peace from days earlier. He ordered her via the translator to come with them. It was not a request. Being brought aboard the Cathar scout ship was like stepping into a living creature's ribcage. The walls were not metal plates, but a smooth, resilient, bone-like material that pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent light. The air was warm and humid, smelling of ozone and strange, alien vegetation. There were no chairs, no consoles with blinking lights. The ship was controlled from a central platform where Kalen and his second-in-command placed their hands on pulsating nodes, seeming to merge with the vessel itself. It was a perfect union of biology and technology, a testament to the Cathar's mastery over genetic engineering. Alara was a prisoner, but she was also a guest. She was given a space to rest, and Spike refused to leave her side, curling up near her feet, a constant, living symbol of her impossible status. Kalen began to question her, not as an interrogator, but as a perplexed scholar. He was a warrior, but his rank also meant he was a guardian of Cathar history and culture. He wanted to understand the why of her actions. For days, as the scout ship moved silently through the nebula, they talked. Ilara, using her deep knowledge of linguistics and anthropology, explained the human concept of empathy. She explained that human strength was not just in the individual, but in the collective, in the willingness of one to sacrifice for another, even for a stranger. She told him stories from human history, of medics running into battle without weapons, of firefighters rushing into burning buildings, of parents who would give their lives for their children without a second thought. Kalen listened, his massive form still and silent. To him, this was a bizarre and inefficient survival strategy. Cathar's strength was in the purity of their genetics, the perfection of the individual warrior. The weak were culled. It was the way of things. The strong protected the young, yes, but they did so with overwhelming ferocity by eliminating all threats. The idea of showing compassion to a potential threat was not just alien, it was illogical, a flaw in the design. Yet he could not ignore the evidence at his feet. The youngling, Spike, was healing faster than expected. Its stress levels were low. It was thriving under the care of this fragile, illogical creature. He was forced to confront a disturbing possibility. What if the human flaw was actually a tool his people had never conceived of? The news of their discovery was sent ahead to the Cathar High Command, and it created a schism that fractured the Empire's monolithic unity. The message was simple but world-shattering. A human has pacified a Cathar youngling using nonviolent methods. It was accompanied by biometric data from Spike and recordings of Ilara's lullabies. The hardliners, the old guard of the warrior caste, dismissed it as a trick. A new form of human biological warfare, perhaps, designed to weaken their children. They called for Kalen's immediate execution for treason and the human's dissection for study. But others, the thinkers, the bioengineers, the matriarchs who oversaw the nurseries, were intrigued. They saw the data. They saw a youngling not weakened, but strengthened. The lullaby, when analyzed, was found to contain certain resonant frequencies that stimulated healing and neurological calm in their young. A happy accident of human evolution had produced a sound that was a key to their own biology. The fatal assumption the Cathar had made about humanity, that they were simple, brutish destroyers, was beginning to crumble. They had only ever seen humanity at war. They had never seen humanity at peace. Meanwhile, on the other side of the veil, Ilara's modified distress signal was finally picked up. But it wasn't a gentle research vessel that answered the call. It was the FCS Victory, a Federation battlecruiser, the flagship of Admiral Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a relic of the old war, a man who saw the Cathar as vermin to be exterminated. When his ship arrived and found a Cathar scout vessel, he opened fire without preamble. Kalen's ship was a scout, not a warship. It was outgunned and overwhelmed. In a desperate act to save the information he now possessed, Kalen put Ilara and Spike into an ejection pod, a Cathar equivalent of the one that had saved her before. His last message to her through the translator was grim. "Show them, show your people the truth. It is the only way." Then his ship, fighting to the last, was atomized by the Victory's main cannons. Ilara was rescued. She was brought aboard the Federation flagship, a cold, sterile environment of gray metal and harsh fluorescent lights. It was a jarring contrast to the living warmth of the Cathar ship. The moment the Marines saw Spike, they raised their rifles. It was only Ilara's desperate, screaming plea that stopped them from firing. Admiral Thorne saw her not as a hero, but as a problem. He listened to her story, his face a mask of stone-cold disbelief. A brave scientist who tamed an alien with kindness. It sounded like a fairy tale. He saw a traumatized, brainwashed victim of alien influence. He saw a collaborator. The concept that a century of military doctrine could be wrong was, to him, more alien than the Cathar themselves. Spike was immediately taken away, sedated and placed in a high-security containment cell, classified as a biological weapon. Ilara was confined to quarters, debriefed by intelligence officers who twisted her words, looking for weaknesses in the Cathar, not for paths to peace. They didn't care about her lullaby. They cared about the location of the nursery world she had described, the world Kalen's ship had been returning to. To Ilara, it was a place of impossible hope, a world full of spikes. To Admiral Thorne, it was the enemy's heart, a strategic target of immense value. He saw a chance to end the war in one glorious, genocidal strike. He would destroy their young, break their spirit, and secure his place in history. The Federation's arrogance was a blinding light. They had the truth in their hands, a living Cathar youngling that showed no aggression, a decorated scientist with an unprecedented testimony, and they chose to ignore it. They were trapped in their own loop of logic, their own fatal assumption. They believed that the only way to deal with a predator was to become a bigger predator. Alara's new battle had begun. She had survived the wilderness. She had faced the enemy and found a friend. Now she had to face her own people and stop them from making the biggest mistake in human history. She was no longer just fighting for survival. She was fighting for the soul of two species. The clock was ticking. The Federation fleet was gathering, preparing for a final, devastating assault on a world of children, an atrocity built on a foundation of lies. And Alara Vance was the only one who knew the truth. Alara's confinement aboard the FCS Victory was a gilded cage of polite dismissal. She was given comfortable quarters, good food, and access to a datapad filled with redacted, Federation-approved news. She was a hero. The media back home was being told. The sole survivor of the Stargazer, rescued from the clutches of the enemy. Her real story was buried under layers of military censorship. Admiral Thorne treated her with a patronizing courtesy that was more infuriating than open hostility. He would visit her, asking for clarification on Cathar fleet movements and planetary defenses, all the while ignoring her pleas to understand the cultural context, to see the bigger picture. To him, her experience was just a data point, a piece of tactical intelligence to be exploited. "Doctor," he'd say, his voice smooth and reasonable, "your bravery is commendable, but you are a scientist. You see the universe in terms of patterns and possibilities. I am a soldier. I see it in terms of threats and responses. The Cathar have been a threat for 112 years. My response is to eliminate that threat." "But you don't understand, Admiral," she would plead, her voice raw with frustration. "Your threat is a civilization. They have art, they have a code, they have families. The reason they fight so hard is because they are protecting their young. The world you're planning to attack isn't a military fortress, it's a nursery. You'd be committing genocide against children." Thorne would just shake his head, a sad, knowing look on his face. "Dr. Vance, you've been through a traumatic ordeal. It's understandable that you've projected human emotions onto the creature. It's a common psychological response. But they are not children. They are larvae, gestating killers. By destroying them before they mature, we save billions of lives in the future." It was like arguing with a brick wall. The Federation's military-industrial complex had built its identity on this war. Generations of soldiers had been trained, trillions of credits had been spent, all based on the simple, seductive lie that the enemy was a monster. To admit otherwise would be to admit that a century of death and sacrifice might have been a tragic, pointless misunderstanding. It was a truth too heavy for them to bear. Alara knew she had to do something. Time was running out. She could hear the thrum of the ship's engines changing, the subtle shifts in vibration as the vast armada gathered around the Victory, preparing for the jump to the Cathar nursery world, a world they had named Hydra's Cradle. She needed an ally, and she found one in the most unlikely of places. Dr. Aris Thorne, the Admiral's own nephew, was a low-ranking xenobiologist assigned to the containment lab where Spike was being held. Aris was a young man, brilliant but overshadowed by his family's military legacy. He had joined the service to please his uncle, but his heart was in science, not war. He had been studying Spike, running scans, analyzing his biology, and the data wasn't matching the official narrative. He found complex neural pathways dedicated to social bonding. He observed the young Cathar's profound stress response to separation from Alara. He saw that Spike refused to eat the synthetic military rations, but would hungrily devour a nutrient paste formulated to match what Alara had given him. Aris was a scientist, and he followed the data. And the data was telling him that Dr. Alara Vance was telling the truth. Alara managed to get a message to him, a simple, coded note passed through a sympathetic medical orderly. "The lullaby, it's not a weapon, it's a key." Aris understood. He took a huge risk. He accessed the audio files from Kalen's scout ship that had been logged as Cathar sonic weaponry. He isolated the recording of Alara humming her grandmother's tune. He filtered out the background noise and played the pure melody into Spike's containment cell. The effect was instantaneous. The young Cathar, who had been agitated and catatonic by turns, grew calm. Its vital signs stabilized. It lay down and went into the deep, healing sleep that Alara had described. It was the proof Eris needed. His uncle was about to commit a war crime based on flawed intelligence. Together, they hatched a desperate plan. They couldn't stop the fleet, but they could warn the Cathar. And they could show the Federation what they were about to do. They needed to get Alara to a communications hub, and they needed to get Spike with her. The breakout was frantic and clumsy. It wasn't a slick spy movie. It was a desperate scramble. Eris triggered a series of false environmental alarms on a different deck, drawing security away. Alara, using a stolen access card, released Spike from his cell. The young Cathar, seeing her, let out a joyful chirp and bounded to her side, a loyal, armored wolf in the cold corridors of the human warship. They made their way to a secondary communications array, a smaller, less guarded hub used for civilian channels. As they ran, klaxons began to blare. They had been discovered. Plasma bolts seared the walls around them. It was a race against time. They sealed themselves in the comms room just as security forces began cutting through the door. Eris worked frantically to bypass the military lockouts, to open a channel that could broadcast on all frequencies, Federation, and he hoped, Cathar. "It's now or never, Doctor," he yelled over the screech of the plasma torch. Alara stood before the broadcast lens, Spike standing protectively at her feet. She wasn't a soldier or a diplomat. She was just a scientist who had seen too much. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice broadcast across the entire fleet, and she prayed into the void beyond. "This is Dr. Alara Vance, formerly of the research vessel Stargazer." Her voice was shaking but clear. "I am speaking to you from the FCS Victory. Admiral Thorne is about to lead this fleet in an attack on a Cathar world. He has told you it is a military target. He is lying." On screens across dozens of warships, her face appeared, tired and determined. "The world you are about to attack is a nursery. It is populated by the Cathar's young. They are not the monsters you've been told they are. They are children. I know this because I have spent the last several weeks with one of them." She stepped aside, revealing Spike to the camera. The young Cathar looked into the lens, unafraid. "This is Spike," she said. "He is not a weapon, he is not a beast, he is my friend." In the command center of the Victory, Admiral Thorne's face was a thundercloud. "Cut the feed! Cut it now!" he roared. But Eris had been clever. He had routed the signal through so many redundant systems that it was like trying to stop a flood with a teacup. Alara's voice continued, rising with passion. "For over a century, we have fought this war because of a fatal assumption. We assumed the Cathar were incapable of peace, of mercy, of anything but destruction. We were wrong. We never tried to understand them. We only tried to kill them, and they have responded in kind, fighting with the ferocity of any parent defending their home." She looked directly into the camera, her eyes pleading with the thousands of soldiers and officers watching. "Look at him," she said, gesturing to Spike. "Does he look like a monster to you? We have a choice right now. We can continue this cycle of death. We can commit an atrocity that will stain the name of humanity forever, or we can be better than this. We can have the courage to admit we were wrong, the courage to try a new way. The spark within us, the thing that makes us human, isn't our capacity for war. It's our capacity for empathy." Then she did the last thing anyone expected. She began to hum. The simple, ancient lullaby her grandmother had sung to her. The melody filled the comms channels, a strange, gentle sound in the midst of a military machine poised for slaughter. Spike, hearing the tune, leaned against her leg and let out a soft, contented rumble. The image was undeniable. A human and a Cathar, predator and prey, standing together in peace. The broadcast lasted for less than 3 minutes before the door was breached and Marines flooded the room, but it was enough. On the bridge of every ship in the fleet, there was a stunned silence. Young ensigns and grizzled captains alike had seen the broadcast. They had seen the larva. They had seen it act not like a beast, but like a loyal pet. They had heard the doctor's plea, and for the first time in a long time, they were questioning their orders. The monolithic certainty of the war had been shattered. And far away, in the swirling clouds of the Veil Nebula on the nursery world of Cathar Prime, the broadcast had also been received. The Cathar High Command, already fractured by Kalen's report, now had visual confirmation. They saw the human the one Kalen had spoken of. They saw the youngling, safe and calm in her presence. And they heard the sonic weapon that their own scientists had just identified as a biological key. They saw a human risking her life not to attack them but to warn them, to save them from her own people. The hardliners were silenced. A new, radical consensus began to form. The human plague was not monolithic. It contained multitudes. Some were destroyers, but some were protectors. As Admiral Thorne's fleet prepared to jump, a new signal appeared. A single Cathar vessel, massive but broadcasting on all channels that it was unarmed. It was the flagship of the Cathar Matriarchy, the ruling council of the Nursery Worlds. It was not coming for a fight. It was coming to talk. The climax of the war did not happen in a blaze of plasma fire and exploding ships. It happened in a tense, sterile negotiation room aboard a neutral station on the edge of the Veil Nebula. On one side sat Admiral Thorne, his face grim, his career and worldview in ashes. On the other side sat the Cathar Matriarch, a being of immense age and power, her obsidian armor covered in the intricate glyphs of her lineage. And in the middle, acting as the bridge, was Dr. Alara Vance. Spike sat at her feet, a silent, powerful reminder of how this impossible meeting had come to be. The negotiations were long and arduous. A century of hatred and misunderstanding could not be undone in a day. There were accusations, grievances, threats, but for the first time they were talking, not shooting. Alara, with her unique understanding of both sides, translated not just the words, but the intent behind them. She explained to the Federation the Cathar's fierce, protective instincts, their code of honor that valued the strength to defend over the strength to conquer. She explained to the Cathar the human fear of the unknown, the history of a species that had always been the apex predator on its own world, and was terrified of no longer being at the top of the food chain. The true turning point came when the matriarch asked Thorne, through Alara, one simple question. "You have seen the data. You have seen our young with your own eyes. Why did you still wish to destroy them?" Thorne was silent for a long time. The blustering, confident admiral was gone. In his place was a tired, old man forced to confront the sum of his life's work. "Because," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "it was easier. It was easier to believe you were monsters than to accept that we might be." It was a stunning admission, a confession that laid bare the heart of the conflict. It wasn't about strategy or resources. It was about fear, fear of being wrong, fear of the other, fear of looking in the mirror and seeing a monster staring back. The ceasefire that was signed that day was not a permanent peace treaty. It was a beginning, a fragile, tentative truce. Prisoner exchanges were arranged. Scientific and cultural exchanges were planned. A buffer zone was established, a space where neither side would tread, a breathing room for two civilizations to reevaluate their entire existence. Alara became the Federation's first ambassador to the Cathar Empire, a role she had unknowingly been training for her entire life. Aris Thorne, hailed as a hero by the new guard and a traitor by the old, was put in charge of the Joint Scientific Commission, studying the strange, wonderful resonance between human and Cathar biology. And Spike stayed with Alara. He was too bonded to her, too changed by his experience to be fully reintegrated into Cathar society. He became a symbol, a living embodiment of the new era. He would often be seen walking the corridors of the embassy on Cathar Prime, a full-grown, terrifyingly powerful creature of obsidian armor and razor-sharp claws, who would gently nudge the hand of his human companion for a reassuring scratch behind his horns. He was a constant reminder that the strongest bonds are not forged in fire, but in vulnerability. Humanity did not win the war, it outgrew it. Alara Vance did not defeat an empire, she revealed its soul. She did not prove that humanity's genetic makeup was superior. She proved that its capacity for compassion was a force more powerful than any DNA sequence. That spark within, the illogical, inefficient, and utterly beautiful core of human courage, had done what a million warships could not. It had won the confidence of its enemies, and in doing so, it had won a future for everyone. It had shown the galaxy that true strength isn't about having the hardest shell. It's about having the courage to open your hand, even when you expect a fist in return. So as you go back into your world, into your own battles and struggles, consider this story. Think about the walls you face, the seemingly insurmountable obstacles, the predators in your own life. We spend so much of our time and energy building bigger weapons, harder armor, stronger defenses. But what if the solution isn't to be found in overwhelming force? We look out at the universe, or even just across our own street, and we see threats to be managed, competitors to be beaten, and aliens to be feared. But what if the greatest aliens are not in the stars, but in the assumptions we hold about each other? What fatal assumption are you living by right now, and what would it take, what small act of courage, for you to see the truth? The answer to that question might not just change your life, it might just change the world.